Hello, world, and welcome to the Innovation Coaching Podcast. My name is Klaus Rostel, and with me today I have Abel Buko. Abel, tell me how I can help.
Right out of the gate like that. Okay.
Right out of the gate.
Well, I have had essentially three very different careers over the last 16, 15 years. It's not exactly the right numbers, but roughly 5 years as a corporate trainer at Apple, where I like literally just 8 hours a day was training people. So I would train customers in how to use Apple products. I would train Apple employees on how to be Apple employees. I would train Apple employees on how to do iPhone repair and different things like that. So I had this really intense, amazing training from Apple on how to be an effective workshop leader, how to basically it was like instructional design crash course on how to like create educational materials based off of what your audience already knows. And I was just kind of given material and then a certain number of hours to learn it, and then I would go teach it. So I got certified professional in Final Cut Pro and in Apple Motion and like all these like random, like I'm not a motion designer, I'm not a video editor, but I wanted to teach it. And so I took the course and got the certification and then started teaching like Final Cut and all these things.
Nice.
And that was a really wonderful time. I spent those years mostly in Hawaii, but I was sent to Alaska for a little bit to train Apple employees up there. I went to California every now and again. And it was a really wonderful time, but I didn't really feel like I was going anywhere. So I did my now normal process. Then it was the first time of just like reaching out to everyone I know in my life who I admire and think is interesting. And it's just like, dear everyone that I admire and who is interesting, I'm stuck. What should I do with my life? And one of my friends is in advertising, and he still is like a pretty big person in advertising, at least in my mind. And he said, you are really organized, people like talking to you, and you're artistic. You're a producer, baby. And like I remember that sentence so clear, like you're a producer, baby. And I was like, I don't know what a producer is. And he was like, trust me. And so then he got me an interview at a really famous ad agency in New York. And then I was in New York working in advertising. And I did that for a
That's pretty cool.
way life takes you places.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun. It was really exciting for like the first year because I had no idea what I was doing. I was just running around like crazy. But he was totally right. I had like a knack for it. I picked it up really quickly. I did really well. And Sweden is like one of the top countries in the world for advertising agencies. And so almost every other project that I was working on in New York was being built by a production company in Stockholm.
Mm.
And I started to grow this network over there. And one day, one of them was like, would you ever consider moving to Sweden? We want to have more American clients, but we don't think they trust our accent when we speak English. And we think if someone spoke like you, they would have more trust in us. And I was like, sure, why not? I'll go for a year and see what it's like. So I went and I worked at two different production companies in Stockholm, doing kind of advertising production. And the longer I was in it, the more I grew to like just really hate it. And it was something that I was really good at. I fit in really well. Like I looked and talked and dressed like everyone that was in the eye of the world, but it wasn't my calling or whatever you want to say. And so within that production company I was at, transitioned into working more with recruitment and organizational culture and like company culture, basically HR, but I don't like saying that. And I did that for a few years, and then I switched to another tech company where my proper role was just like diversity manager and sustainability manager. So I have these like three careers, being a public speaker slash workshop leader, working in advertising as a producer and a project manager, and then most recently being organizational development and corporate culture. And in all of my jobs I've had, at some point, one of my managers or bosses says the same thing to me, that I think one day you're going to be my boss, or one day I think you're going to own your own company. And every time they said that, I'm like, that's really flattering, but I don't know what to do with that. That's just random information that I don't know what to do with. And I decided last year, I was feeling that urge kind of building, and I was listening to them saying that. And I decided that in 2024, I was going to wrap up what I was doing and I was going to start my own company and just give this a go. But I really had no clue on like what to do. And I was forced into this a bit quicker than I thought, because the company I was at unfortunately had some financial losses and half the company was laid off in a reorganization. So I've had, since January of this year, been living on my income insurance, applying for jobs, and trying to figure out, if I were to own a business, what would it be?
Mm-hmm.
Should I should I give you a moment to jump in and say anything, or should I just keep going on this long introduction?
Well, I'm just trying to figure out where this takes us. So far, I'm fascinated. Sounds pretty cool. Also, I like it. There's a thing I love, and that's when people come on the podcast or any conversation for that matter and say, here's stuff I suck at and here's stuff I'm good at, right? So I always find it refreshing when somebody says, I did this and I was quite good at it, because that's nice, right? It's nice, not, we're generally pretty humble, but when you meet somebody for the first time, you only know what they say. So if you say, well, I did it and I was sort of okay, and you're like, oh, and your name is Michael Jordan, and this basketball thing you played, you were sort of okay at, oh, because here I don't know. So it's really refreshing when you say, yeah, I did this and I was good at it. And then they said, you're going to be my boss. It's like, okay, sounds good. I also find it hilarious that the Swedes wanted you for the accent, which is a whole other side discussion. I think my speaking career would be harder if I did the Danish accent, or in fact, I know that.
Yeah, you don't have an accent at all, I can hear.
Not at all, right? I have some years in Seattle in my childhood. I have a half American stepfather, and I've kept it up.
Mm,
So I can do the Danish
mm.
accent, which is very different. The Danish accent is very easy to understand, but it is quite hard to take seriously. And if you want to be an overpaid rock star consultant public speaker, then it is going to be very hard with this accent. Not impossible. We had a foreign minister who talked like this. Not easy at all, where the American accent is well known, right? It's comforting to people and discomforting to others. But that's a whole other segment. Keep on talking and tell
Mm,
me where we are. Tell me what, so far, the only thing I don't know, Abel, is what you need help with. But I have some guesses.
yeah. So my original idea was that I would start my own company working with company culture and HR, because HR is the butt of every joke. It has been since like the 80s or the 90s. Like there's just all these cliches in movies and TV shows about HR being this like process-driven, soulless person. And working in HR, I encountered both of those kinds. So that stereotype is very much alive in the HR world, though it is a stereotype, but that's not definitely everyone in there. And there is a very large, very vocal group that's trying to change what HR is and how it works. And there's a company in the US that's basically doing that I really admire. And I found one in the UK that's also doing it. But I didn't really find anything in Sweden that had that same sort of approach of not just calling it people and culture, but actually changing the mandate of what HR is and how it works, so that it's not always protecting the company over the employee. Like at times it acts more as a union almost, where it is defending the employee from the company while still keeping the employee in the company. So I was really fascinated by that, and I was trying to go down that road, but it never felt right because I don't really have the experience to really talk about that or to work with it. Like I've worked in HR for like 4 or 5 years, but only at like two companies, and I don't feel like I'm an authority on that. And so that knocked me back down. I was like, well, what do I do now? Like I want to start a company, but what do I do? And this is when we get to the point. So in August, I found out about an open audition for TEDx Göteborg, and I decided to give it a go. And I found out 1 week beforehand, and I had a topic, and within those like 7 days, I picked my topic. I wrote the script, I refined it down, and I went to a co-working space and grabbed some strangers. And I was like, hey, I need to do something really quick. And I just did my audition for these strangers. And then after I finished, I was like, okay, so do you know what my idea is? Do you know how it's relevant to your life? Do you know how you can implement it in your life? And I got feedback, and then I changed the script a little bit. And then I just like memorized and memorized and memorized, went to my audition on Saturday, and there was like 25 or 30 people, and it was just like boom, boom, boom. Like one person finishes, the next one goes up, and there's this big crowd of people, a stage and a microphone. And I did my audition on Saturday, and on Monday I got an email asking if I wanted to come in for a chat. And I went in for the chat, and they asked me to be a speaker coach.
Very cool.
And so just based again, I'm not a very humble Swede right now, but like this is kind of what I'm working through right now is to not be so humble all the time. But based on my audition alone, they're like, you should be a coach. Like you could also do a talk for us one day, but like your process of having 7 days to do that and everything, like that's what we need as a coach. And that's when it hit me that that's probably the one skill that I have that I've really worked on over the last 16 years, where I've had exposure in advertising, so I have this persuasive language kind of aspect to how I approach script writing. I have that Apple background where I have this instructional design sort of pedagogy to how I approach and research where the audience is and where they need to go from there. And then the detail I left out is that back in university, I went to a really kooky, wacky, hippie college where I did interpretive dance classes almost every semester. And so I have
Ooh.
a lot of experience doing very interesting, avant-garde, out there stage performances. And since university, I've actually done like a handful of very out there stage performances. So I realized that I've built up this kind of unique constellation of very different approaches to public speaking and stage performance that make me stand out. And I was like, okay, I'll turn that into a business. I'll be like a speaker coach, and I'll help individuals like company leaders or managers be better public speakers. But I'll also help founders of startups find their message so that it's easily communicated and it's engaging. And then I'll coach them in how to do it. So that's what's happened. And last Monday, I submitted my business plan to like a basically a small business grant where I'll have a little bit of an income for my first 6 months. And yeah, that's where I am. My company is going to be called Soapbox. And I chose that name because oftentimes, like soapboxing comes from like the 1800s, 1900s, where these merchants would be traveling around and they would come to a square and get the wooden box that the items came in, and they would put it down, stand on the wooden box, and then they would start giving these really passionate, over the top kind of flamboyant sales pitches to try and gather and attract people to come over and buy their wares. And I think that soapboxing today it's often seen as a negative thing. Like they'll talk about a politician as soapboxing, where they're just going on and on and on and everything. But the origin of it really is just like a really passionate, emotional, over the top talk. And I want to like reclaim that as soapboxing as being a good thing, because we have to sit through so many talks and so many presentations, and there's no reason they should be boring. Like, I don't care if it's the financial figures from Q4 or if it's your new idea for how to promote equality in the workplace. Like, everything should have a like cinematic, engaging vibe to it. Yeah, so that's what Soapbox is going to be.
Okay, very cool. Now we'll notice a thing here, Hamill, or at least I notice a thing already. I don't know if you notice it, that you still haven't told me what you need help with.
Good point. So I think what I want help with is going through my business idea slash plan and sort of just rubber ducking the viability of it, or if I should be focusing on a different market. Because, oh, here we go. Here we go. So my primary market, or kind of target audience right now at least, is focusing on founders and kind of leaders in either startups or small companies that are looking to scale or grow their business. Because I've talked to a lot, I've been hanging out in incubators and accelerators recently. And the one thing that I keep on hearing over and over is, I went to business school and I learned how to do this and that and structure this and blah, 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 blah. But there's never a class on public speaking. And when I have to go do my pitch, I'm just like terrified. And I'm like, well, what, like, do you use a PowerPoint? Do you use Keynote? And then like, I look at their slides and they're just ugly and difficult to look at. And I'm like, that's another one of these random skill sets that I've built is not so much graphic design, but more specifically like presentation design. And so I had a little test project with one company where I took their investor pitch deck and I cleaned it up and made it look super premium and expensive. I rewrote their script and made a messaging framework, and then I coached them in how to deliver it, and it worked fantastically. So the problem is these people tend to not have money.
Mhm.
Like if you're a two-person startup in an incubator, you don't have a lot of money. If you're in an accelerator program, you're a small company, again, you don't have a huge budget to hire some speaker coach to come in and make you a fancy looking PowerPoint and tell you how to hold your hands and like when you should lean in and lean back while talking. So I have a bit of a problem there that how am I've identified a target audience, but they don't have money really to pay for me so much. And then like the second kind of follow-up to that is the people that would have money, like these big leaders and larger companies and whatnot. I'm not sure how to reach them because I mean, even though I've been in the public speaking world for a long time, I'm not like super connected in it. I don't know all the events people and company leaders in Göteborg or in Sweden. So I have a bit of a problem with how to find these people and a bit of a problem with how are the people that I know I can help the most going to pay for my services?
Now we're talking, right? Now we're talking. So a couple of things, we're a little bit in luck here because part of my work, I sometimes do startup coaching and I do public speaking training and I help startups with pitch training. And I even have an online course on PowerPoint design that I did for a German pharmaceutical company that's now publicly available on as a thing people can buy, like 15 tips on PowerPoint. So I know the space you're in reasonably well, right? It's not what I do full time, but it is part of what I do.
All right.
So I can share some experience that may or may not be useful. The first thing is you are right on. Most of the people who have the need don't have any money today. Today. And one of the things I've done a couple of times is to make the payment something that happens later. Right. So there were a couple of guys, they were applying for a grant and they were going to pitch. They had a pitch as part of that. And they hired me to come in for a couple of hours of pitch training. And the deal was that I would get a little bit of money if they didn't do anything right. There was a little bit of guaranteed money, not a lot, but some. And if they actually went ahead and got the grant, partly because of the pitch training, maybe just because they were brilliant all along, but that was at least the deal that if they got the grant, they would pay out more money. But no matter what, they wouldn't pay it out until after they'd gotten the results. So it was doing the work and then getting paid quite a bit later, and either getting paid a little but not nothing, or getting paid still not a huge amount but something for if they actually managed. And in this case, right, the numbers were small. It was 150 euros was the guaranteed thing for, I think we did 2 hours of work. And if they got the money, it was 500 euros. So we weren't talking huge amounts anyway, but we were at least talking some money. And if that had been what I did full time, well, that could easily have been racked up to a decent amount. This was just a side project as part of some pitch training I've done where they said, hey, we like that. Can we get some more? So the first thing is
Mm,
founders, a lot of founders don't have money today, but they might have money at some point.
mm,
That's number one thing. Number two thing is there's a friend of mine, Philip, who I wrote a pricing book with, Philip Fuchik. We wrote Pricing Expertise together. He has a friend who's a graphic designer.
mhm,
That friend I often mention because that friend, his market positioning is that he is a graphic designer who helps people who've been burned by too cheap graphic designers. And that's a really nice positioning, right? It means there are a lot of people who don't come to him because he says, I only work with people who have been burned by too cheap graphic designers. So a lot of people don't go to him
mm,
because they're not there yet. But when they do, they don't argue price.
mm,
And what I see here, what you say is you say you have a ton of skill and experience with this sort of people, where if you went out and said, I'm not looking for founders to help them pitch, I'm looking when you've already done your friends and families round and you're going to pitch your series A or series B,
mm,
then I come in and help, because that's a different thing. It's the same skill set you need. They're further along on their journey. They're less, their pitch decks are less crap, but there's still usually room for improvement. And the founders or whoever is doing the pitching, there's usually also room for improvement, but now they have money because now they're not out hunting for 100,000 euro or 50,000 euro, they're hunting for 3 million.
mm,
So if you went out and said, I do pitch training and help restructure pitch decks for founders who are looking to get that series A or B round, it's a completely different story
mhm,
because you won't get the mass audience of the new founders, but it means the ones you'll get will have money because they're at a place where they know that this is essential. They also have some money because they're started, they have some track record, they probably have a team that's growing, and they're looking for a bigger amount. So paying you some money is not going to be a big thing.
mm,
Let's say they paid you 10,000 euros to help them secure 2 million, right? If they believe that you will significantly add to their chance, those 10,000 euros are nothing. And for you, I'm hoping 10,000 euros isn't too bad.
no. It's interesting that you say that because I don't think I realized until now, but that test project that I mentioned that went really well, that's essentially what they were going through. They've been around for almost 2 years, I think. And within their incubator, they've had lots of different coaching from like, startup coaching, business coaching, and whatnot. And I had asked before I met them, like, don't you have people like this in your incubator? Like, that feels like that's something they should be offering.
Mhm.
And they're like, yeah, 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 yeah. We met them. And then we met them, and the first thing I did was I was like, I don't want to know about your business. I want to know, who are you? Like, where are you from? Like, how did you found this? Like, I want to know more about your backstory. And we spent almost 3 hours just kind of not only talking about their histories, but I got a much fuller picture. And they said that that was to them the first time in those 2 years that anyone went that deep and like actually wanted to know that much about them. And I'm wondering now if like they were so open to that because they had been with all these previous coaches that were just telling them like, well, when someone asks a question, lean forward. And, they're giving this very general advice that wasn't really useful because at that point they had already gone through general advice and they needed something specific to their actual topics and like their actual mannerisms that they're working through.
Bingo. So I think you're spot on there. And also there's a huge difference in modalities, right? One of the things that we sometimes get confused with when we hear about other people's work is that because we don't understand it, we tend to think that modalities don't matter. So let's say you're a writer,
Mhm.
right? Let's say you are a writer and writing is what you do for a living. Now, here are a couple of ways you can be involved in writing. One is you can write stuff. You can write novels or business books or OMs or sort of script writing. You can actually write stuff. That's one modality. You could also help other people write stuff. That's a very, very different thing. You can write stuff for people, like being a ghostwriter or being a copywriter, but you're doing the writing, but it's with their name on it at the end. That's a third thing. You could also teach writing, right? You could have writing classes. You could also be a writing coach where you don't help people do it, but you guide them on the path. These are five different ways, five different modalities of using writing professionally, but they're very different. There are people who are brilliant writers who are terrible writing coaches. There are people who are brilliant at teaching writing who are insanely bad at writing themselves, because writing doesn't necessarily just take the skill, it also takes what do you want to say? Are you prepared to get beaten up by the audience because they hate what you have to offer? Do you actually know how to speak the language? All these sorts of things. And it's really easy to confuse these and think, oh, you're good at this, right? Just like you said, public speaking training. There are plenty of people who are great public speaking trainers who are not necessarily that good public speakers, not because they don't have the skill set, but because they don't know how to sell it, or they don't know what they're talking about, or what they're good at is capturing the mood of a class or a crowd and playing off them and making them shine, but they're not necessarily that interesting themselves, or vice versa. Just because you're a great speaker doesn't mean you're a great speaker trainer. So the first thing is on that is to kind of to isolate the modalities. And the more you isolate and the more you say, this is my kingdom, the better the chance you have of ruling it. If I go into somebody and say, I'm a startup coach, they'll say, oh, okay, so you coach startups? Yeah, okay. Anything from business plans to investor relations to product development to team management to leadership, I've got you covered. I know all that shit. If I instead just say I'm a coach, then part of my coaching will be startup coaching, but there will be lots that are not about that. It might be about relationships or how to be a Fortune 500 CMO or all that sort of thing. That's not necessarily startup based. And of course, if two people start on the same path with the same skill set, the startup coach and the general coach, well, the startup coach is going to get a lot more startup coaching experience because they simply do that, where the normal coach might have that be a little bit of their portfolio, but not a huge bit. And if you say, I do public speaking training for startups, okay, well, now we're narrowing it. If you say, I do pitch training for startups, and if you then say, I do pitch training for founders who are looking for not their first, but their next investment round, suddenly you're pretty niche. But it also means within that niche, you're probably pretty strong, or at least seem pretty strong, and you will quickly grow stronger. And if you say what you do is you come in, you look at their pitch deck, you talk with their founders, you do deep listening interviews with them, not 20 minutes of you giving them tips, but 3 hours of conversation. And after that, you restructure their pitch deck, you give them some training on how to pitch, and then you throw them into the shark's den, right? The lion's den, the shark den. Maybe the shark and lion den, if we're looking for what it's like. That's a pretty clear offer. And if you say you do that offer and the people you do it for are people who are not looking for their first investment, but for their next one, then you're automatically targeting people who also have a bit of money and a bit of traction and know somewhat of what they're doing, but they can probably still need help. That's not bad at all. In fact, that's pretty clear, right? And if that could be an offer, because that leads us to the next thing, which is that when people have companies, and I am terrible at this myself, it is limiting what they can do and making it into specific offers is terribly hard. Because we know so much and we can do so much and we want to do so much. And most of us are tempted to, when somebody asks, what do you do? I say, what do you need? One of the reasons I enjoy coaching is I get to start with saying, how can I help? And then people start talking, and then I say, okay, so that's who I am today, which really appeals to me in my broad skill set and my reasonable degree of experience and my kind of curiosity about people. But it also means that whenever you say, here's the package, do you want it? You're making it easier to buy. Where if you just say, this is what I do, people are like, okay, that's good, but what the hell does that mean? If you say, I work with startups, it's like, okay, like, do you drive them around, or do you do their websites, or do you kill them, or what do you do? It's like, no, 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 no. I do pitch training. I do pitch training for startup founders, and I also clean up their investor pitch decks. Okay. And that package costs 10,000 euros or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
It costs 2% of the round you're trying to raise. Okay, well, that's cool. But that means they can say, I want that, or I don't want that. And one of the hardest things for people in kind of a founder mode is limiting what they're selling to something people can say yes or no to. One of the really nice things about selling physical products like a shoe or a cake or something like that is that people can see it and they can say yes or no.
Mm.
And even then, it tends to be what color, what size, when do you want it delivered, how do you want to pay for it, do you want one, do you want five, all this complication. And that's with a physical product that exists, where the moment it becomes something service oriented and especially expertise oriented, it just goes off the rails. Because then when I ask, so, well, what can
Mm.
you do? Well, what do you need? And that requires an insane trust level for people to do that, even for free. And if they're getting paid for it, it's even worse. So if you can figure out what it is you're offering and compress it down into something that people can actually say yes or no to, then you've come a long way. And it sounds like from that test case, you've got a thing there. Added to that, you have the Apple background, which helps, especially in your branding and
Yeah.
marketing. Saying you work for Apple for 5 years is not bad. You have a ton of practical experience, and you have, like, here's a test case. You have your first customer, right? You could reproduce
Mm.
that. You could do that exact thing for 1,000 startups. They just need to know you exist.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a I have taken so many notes on this tiny little piece of paper in front of me now that I have no idea if I'm going to be able to make sense of later. Um, but that kind of goes into another thing that I was thinking about with when you mentioned like 1,000 startups. I'm in a kind of medium-sized city, I guess, in Göteborg. I mean, it's the fourth largest city in the Nordics, second in Sweden, but it's not a large city. And so I do sort of have this panic that there's only like a finite number of these companies in this city. So I totally do need to be, I think, working um, with really anyone I can find on the internet, but then that becomes even harder to reach them because like with Göteborg, I know where the incubators and accelerators are. I've been making connections with people that run them. I've been like building that network out. And so that feels very certain. But I do think that for just the viability of my monthly income, I do need to have a broader pool that I'm working with.
Definitely, definitely. And also, I think you have an advantage that you can do it either physically or you can do it virtually,
Hmm.
which means you have the potential for a pretty broad client base, but you also have the opportunity to say, this is a premium service. I'm going to come to you. We're going to spend some time together. And then based on that, I'm going to leave your offices after I've created the fresh pitch deck and you feel comfortable with that. And you've tweaked it so it's a process, right? You could say, I sell a 2-day process and I appear on your
Hmm.
doorstep and I leave when it's done. And when I leave, you will have a fresh pitch deck that is sharper and better. Two, you will have training in pitching that, and you will be more at home in what you're actually selling. And that's a 2-day process. I come to you, here's the cost. On top of that is, of course, flights and hotels, unless the cost is high enough that that doesn't matter. That's also a position.
Right,
That's not bad. Because then it doesn't really matter where you are. Sure, it's easier in Göteborg where you can take your bike, but you could do that anywhere.
right.
And that's also understandable. Then people are going to think, okay, well, do we want to spend 2 days with this guy where apparently we spend X amount of hours together on that deep listening interview, and then we spend some time together on looking at his first draft for the new deck, and then we refine that, and then after we agree on that, we spend some time together on the actual pitch training, and then at the end we say, okay, what now, and goodbye. Like, to me, that doesn't sound like a bad 2 days.
Yeah. That's such an obvious thing that has never occurred to me.
Here I cheat a little bit because I've sometimes been tempted to do exactly that as my job.
Hmm.
One of my biggest problems is that I have a very hard time limiting what I do because I have so many streams of opportunities coming in. And whenever I say this is what I do, then there'll come something in from another opportunity stream, which is why I've finally settled on my expertise is getting shit done and helping people get better at that, which is what it says on my webpage. It's what my latest book was about. That's what I do my keynotes on. It's getting shit done. And how do you do that? And I help people get shit done, which, by the way, doesn't track badly when I have a podcast where I help people break through issues. But that's also incredibly broad. And it means that it's hard for people to figure out what the hell do I sell,
Mm, right.
right? Because they get the expertise, which is nice. And I love doing the work and I'm reasonably good at it. But it's not packaged cleanly. So one of the reasons why this so much for me is so easy to come up with a package that I feel makes sense is because I've considered that exact package for myself. I've helped people do this, right? I've helped people do these exact
Mm,
things. So I know it's viable. And I've even made money doing these exact things. And I'm thinking that you have, with the credentials you have, the skill level you have, the fact that you're a pleasant human being and make a great first impression, and you're not afraid to try, I think it's if it's not a slam dunk, then it's at least worth the shot.
mm. I really identify a lot with what you're saying about like what do you do, what do you need? Because that was the hardest part of like trying to land on like if I'm going to open a company, what will it do? Because I have all of these completely like disparate skill sets that I'm just so obsessive about that like I can't just like it's not enough to like kind of open up Final Cut. I want to get the pro certification on it. It's not enough just to learn design basics. I want to know everything about this. And so I've gone so deep, and like someone last week on Thursday, she called me a gap filler. And they're like, I'm a dream employee because like I'll be hired for this role, but then no matter what comes up, I jump on it, I figure it out, and I do it really, really well. And like it's exactly like you're saying, like that. I mean, that's why so many of my mentors have been telling me that like you don't belong in a company, you belong owning a company because you thrive when you're jumping around to all these different things. And I think that's a little bit of why I landed on this specific thing that we're narrowing down around like pitch coaching, because it's not just helping them know how to, phrase their words and enunciate them. And it's not just helping them to write the script so that it's in a clear and concise and persuasive language. It's not just doing design elements, like getting to jump around to all these different things, which feels really good to have landed on. But on that same note, like I had two friends come to me 2 weeks ago and they're like, we've been doing this podcast for a while and we've sort of plateaued in how many new subscribers we're getting. Do you have any ideas? I'm like, well, let's sit down. And we talked for like 30 minutes. And at the end, they had this bullet list of like, okay, you need to do this, you need to do this, you should do a live event. And I was just, I was like, these things seem like obvious good ideas to me, but they were to them, like so much of it was like brand new information. And I'm like, well, I should be able to sell that too. And now I'm like spinning out from all these other ways that I can be working with things. And I think that I need to probably settle on one for now and kind of get that going. And then I don't know. What do you think? I feel like you've done a similar path.
I think that ironically enough, I think you should look at the conversation we're in right now and let that be a sobering guiding thought.
How so?
Because right now, how much are you paying for this, Sabbath?
Nothing.
Nothing, exactly, right? And if Shayna had come to you and said, "Hey, you should go on Klaus's podcast. It'll only cost you 300 euros, and you're going to get super valuable advice."
Hmm,
I don't think we'd be here,
right.
and that's not because I don't think I have valuable advice, and I don't. It's not that I don't think we don't connect. We definitely do, but that's a huge leap, And just taking the time to get free advice from somebody when you see that they might be worth it is hard. Getting them to pay for it is even harder. I have coaching clients, I have paying coaching clients, which is really nice, but that is hard. It's hard to build. It's because it's so obscure what you're getting.
Mm.
It is much easier to find somebody to make a business out of painting people's bathrooms or fixing their sink or something like that, where it's clear what the value is,
Mm.
than saying, talk to me, and afterwards it will be valuable. Because A, what if it isn't?
Mm.
Which is a risk.
Mm.
B, what if I just don't like you? Right? C, what if you make no sense? And D, even if it's valuable, how much is it? Right? We can do that as a simple exercise here, right now, at this moment, and this is just for the mind game. So there's no commitment to this, and I'm not trying to lure you into some weird trap.
Sure.
But if you had to look at the conversation we've had right now and put a price on that you'd be willing to pay, what would that be? Now you've had it, right? We're nearing the end of our conversation. It's not going in. You know what you got. What has that been worth? And while you think, I think there's a pretty good chance you have no idea. Right? Is it worth 100 euros? Is it worth 1,000? Is it worth 15? Who the hell knows? How the hell are you going to price this conversation? And that's after we've had it, right? So let's just, for the hell of it, let's just try this, because I think this is also going to make your life easier moving forward. One, has this conversation been valuable to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So let's start there, right? Two, I'm going to ask in a moment for what takeaways you have, so we'll get to that. But do you feel you have some takeaways, some things you can actually use? So not just like inspirational, but also like, okay, here's some things I know, like actionable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
excellent, right? That's two good starts. Now the tricky part, what's that worth? And again, I don't want you to pay anything. That's not what we're doing here. This is to make your life easier. And if somebody else is listening to it out there, because this part is shit hard. Right? What price tag? Let's just try it for the fun of it. Give me three price tags you could put on this conversation and your reasons. Three different ones.
Three different ones.
Three different.
Well, my brain immediately jumped to that there's been, I mean, I can't count them. Like my little note sheet is chaos right now, but I think there's probably like three or four very like literal things. Um, like around the little now, more later cost structure or payment structure. So like three or four like concrete things like that. But there's also been just this kind of psychological help. And so my brain immediately jumped to like, well, what does a therapist cost? And I was thinking how a lot of, yeah, and a lot of therapists in Sweden at least are like 1,000 crowns a session or something like that. And I was like, okay, well, that's probably like a starting point, because while like the three or four concrete things aren't like gonna revolutionize my business plan, they definitely are pointing me in a direction that didn't have before. That's going to be super useful. The other side, though, I feel like is more impactful is um, you calling this a sobering moment and sort of validating this thing, because I never owned a business. And so I need sort of external strangers to like remind me that I'm not just talking to myself and that I actually am onto something. And so it felt more like a therapy session in a way. So like 1,000 crowns or like 100 euros is kind of where I started. But then my brain was like, that's, I don't know that like if his website said for like 1,000 euros, we can have this 45-minute conversation and who knows what will come out of it. So I was like, okay, but if it said 50 euros and my friend gave me this like raving review of like you have to talk to him, then I would have puffed that up. Like I would have done the 50 euros based off of that like very animated word of mouth sort of review of you. But for a third, I can't really think of a third. I mean, I think anything higher than that, I would have a hard time motivating or thinking about it, I think maybe.
Sure. Okay, so that gives us two prices and one unknown, right? One is about 100 euros, another is about 50 euros. Now comes the really annoying part.
Oh.
Let's say that this conversation made it easier for you to package what you're doing and go out and find paying clients,
Hmm.
which is not unreasonable, right? It's not the only thing, and you were already on the path, but this hopefully makes it easier and clearer. You might even compare it to helping restructure somebody's pitch deck.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And if we look at that, now we're suddenly saying, so what are you going to sell? And are you going to sell it at 50 or 100 euros? Probably not.
Hmm.
Because if we look at value, then it could be easily argued that this is 50 euros or 100 euros or zero. But it could also be pretty easy to say, okay, what are the odds of this helping you land one more 10,000 euro client?
Hmm.
They're there, right? They're not zero, they're not 100, but they're somewhere there. Okay, so then this is obviously
Hmm.
a lot of money. And but how the hell do we price that, right? It would be just as easy to say this session should cost 10,000 euros, but that feels like a lot.
Hmm.
But if you're doing the same thing with some founders and you're saying, yeah, but if my help helps you unlock that 2 million funding, then of course 10,000 is a small price to pay. And they'll say, yeah, of course, here's the
Hmm.
10,000 euros. But if you say, well, if it was a therapy session that allowed you to have the same kind of improved chance of doing it, then even with rave reviews from your friend, you probably wouldn't chance it at more than 50 euros. And both are reasonable. And now you have a pricing that's between 10,000 and 50. That's a pretty big gap.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that it's tricky, right? And that's where it's nicer to have this take it or leave it, is that if I came to you and said, Abel, we're going to talk, and it's going to cost you 10,000 euros, then you would probably say,
Hmm.
hard pass. Like, I don't even know what you're thinking. You must be on weird steroids, Klaus, because they are growing your ego in ways that that requires steroids. And I say, okay, fair enough. But if I say, okay, how about I help you structure your business and make it clear what it is you're selling, and that becomes a pivotal moment potentially in growing your €1 million business. Say, well, 10,000 for that, yeah, but just I'll take that chance, right? That seems like a reasonable thing. If it works, I know it's not guaranteed, but if it works, that seems like a fair gamble. It's the same thing.
Hmm.
Positioning, pricing, value, it's one big muddled pile of poop. And one of the trickiest things is figuring out where you stand in this logic and how you think of things. Because the moment you said, oh, this is sort of like a therapy session, that meant you were thinking therapy prices.
Yep.
Where if you'd instead said, this feels like business development, then if this means I can add 20% to my bottom line next year, then you're thinking that.
Hmm.
And imagine that you hadn't been you where you are now, but you'd been one of these startup founders who's been going for 4 years, they're making 2 million a year, and they're looking for that next series round. Imagine them saying, hey, but we'd like your help, and if we get it, it'll be a breakthrough for us, and we'll be able to, we have a significantly higher chance of getting that money.
Hmm.
We'd like to pay you 50 euros. And you say, yeah, how about no? On the other hand, if they have no money, then 50 euros seems like, okay, well, 50 euros is nice. It's a nice dinner. It's not bad for an hour of work. There are many people in the world who'd be more than happy to get 50 euros for an hour of work. And I've been that person many times. And both of them have valid points. So that's why I wanted to take this detour to show that the pricing side of it is crazy. And the pricing logic side of it is crazy. And of course, it would have been nicer if you'd said, "Yeah, Klaus, I'd like to pay you 10,000." That's not my point, right? That's not where we're going with this. But it is that it's hard. And when you ask people, "What's this worth to you?" How the hell do they know? And then they grasp for straws, right? They grasp for anything they can find. Oh, it reminds me of therapy, or it reminds me of a painting, or it's a little bit graphic design, or I once did this for that. And that means that if you want to do this, which I think would be brilliant, then one of the things that you should go out and do is define what are you doing? Who are you doing it for? I think you're pretty good there. But also, you need to tell them what the pricing logic is, because else you'll be the one stuck with people say, I want this, and they want to pay you 100 euros for potentially giving them that breakthrough that gives them millions. And it won't even be unfair.
You've done a very effective job of spinning it from therapy into to business coaching, because that's one part. Like I do have all this experience that's leading towards this, but when it comes to pricing and value, like that's one aspect of advertising that I was never in any way associated with or had any exposure to, and it's one aspect that I just in general doesn't really interest me. And so I've never really had like a rabbit hole that made me go down that. And it's also the part that I I see it now. Yep, the book. Um, that's the part that I've been struggling with the most, because I feel like this. I mean, it's exactly what you're talking about. I just get nervous of like, well, I don't want to say too much because then they'll say no. But if I say too little, then I can't pay my bills. And like, should I just figure out like the minimum amount I need in order to pay all my bills and like somewhat eat healthy food for the month and then charge that much? And I think I need to, I'm not think I know now that I really need to go down a rabbit hole of like, what's the value and how does that scale with different stages of companies and things like that?
Well, I don't want to plug the book on my own podcast, but just in case anybody out there is wondering, right? One of the reasons I find this interesting is also I did write with Philip, we did write a book on pricing expertise, on how to price expertise, which functions differently from commodity pricing. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, but is also one that is incredibly relevant for any sort of founder or freelancer. Is how do you price it? What sort of thing is relevant? Who do you compare yourself to? What sort of logic do you use? I normally say that I don't like pricing by the hour, but if people force me to do that, then I will speak very slowly and ask many questions. And then they say, oh, so pricing you by the hour is kind of silly. And I say, yeah, because the kind of work I do most of doesn't really translate that well into that, which is also why when my coaching is priced variably depending on who people are. And if they say, but what's your rate? Then my rate's 800 euros for an hour. And some people say, holy crap, that's a lot of money. And some people say, oh, that's not a lot. I thought you were good. And some people say, oh, that seems reasonable. Because pricing is also, we tend to think of pricing as this sort of objective thing, and it's really not. It is in no way objective. It is completely subjective. The value is subjective, the perception, it's always contextual. It depends on who's buying, when are they buying, why are they buying, and how are they buying, and also how are they paying, right? To your startup founder who has zero money, then 100 euros for advice is a lot of money. But if you say, hey, how about I get 1% of the money you make without me, or the money you make from my help, they're like, okay, how's that not a perfect win?
Hmm.
So all this sort of thing is also part of that journey. And the reason I wanted to take us down that rabbit hole was that depending on how people see you is also how they'll value you.
Hmm.
No matter what you do. Will they see it as art or as business coaching or as therapy or as experience or entertainment? They have different logics for these things, even if on paper they're the same thing. But with that, before we go down another rabbit hole, it is time to get to the roundup phase of this. This has been an extra long episode, but I've also been on a bit of a hiatus, so that is fair. We have a few extra long episodes here to start with, and that means we're now at the end of this, and that means I want to do two things. The first one is to thank you. Thank you not just for sharing your challenge with me. That takes trust, and I appreciate that. And I know you had a recommendation, but it still takes trust and openness to do that. Thank you. The second part of it is that you've not just shared it with me, but with our listeners out there. And if somebody's sitting feeling, I can recognize that. I may be in a different business, or I may be in the same business, or I may be looking at similar things, but I can recognize some of what he's talking about. You've helped inspire some people, which is really nice. Thank you for that. And then I have something you should do now, which I ask everybody to do on the podcast, and that is to share with me 3 takeaways, 3 things. There could be more, but 3 things that you take with you from this. They can be negative, they can be positive, they can be something you're going to do differently, they can be something you're now sure you're not going to do differently. That's okay. But 3 things you take away from our time together.
Well, just to the most immediate thing, this discussion of pricing and value is a topic that I knew was there, and that's been the weakest part of working with my business plan. I think now I have a better understanding, but more importantly, I know where to go look now. Like before, it was just, I don't know even what does Google for in order to figure this out. And so now, like, I may not have the answers, but I definitely, like, I see the map a little bit of how that's going to work. So that's really, really valuable and good to know. The payment structure discussion around a little now, more later, that was something that I had already been thinking about. I had thought about like contracts around like equity for a period of time and things like that, but that felt like it wouldn't, because like most of these companies like may not actually make it. But I think the more solid route of like, hey, well, you're going to do this for this specific round and this specific event. So if you win it, then I'm going to get X of that. Like that's a much clearer, more easy to work with a structure to it. And then your whole discussion around modalities was really interesting to me, especially around me thinking that I like identify with a lot of what you were saying about like, what do you want or what do you do? Like, well, what do you need? Like, that's totally just my mindset and where I want to go. And realizing that I need to really pick the modalities that are my strongest and to package those up so that it's very opaque for people to understand and to like point to and choose, while at the same time not turning away the random other stuff. Like the example I gave with my friend's podcast, like giving them that advice and helping them. It may not directly help with Soapbox, but it will indirectly build and to add to it in a more sort of like a brand, like in advertising. It's not so much direct sales helping them with their podcast, but it is brand building, which every single study since the 80s shows that that's a much stronger way to work with your company. So yeah, those are my 3.
Thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more. I even have a podcast for that purpose, also to keep me sharp and help people and get inspired. It may not directly pay anything, definitely has value. Now, thank you for that. And I called you Abel to begin with. We even talked about names before we started. Now I slipped and called you Abel, but sometimes you make mistakes, and that's okay.
I answered to both.
To all of our listeners out there, I wanted to say thank you for listening in. This has been the Innovation Coaching Podcast. You have heard Abel Bucco and me, your host, Klaus Rostel. Thank you for listening.